Ludmilla joined the other adventurers as they gathered around the gate that Miss Bastogne opened at the end of the chamber, and Ludmilla awaited her turn to enter along with the other scouts. As per procedure, the frontline fighters, the defenders and vanguards of each party, entered first to secure the landing. It was most likely safe on the other side, but it was the sort of thing they could only practice at the start of an expedition. After the expedition vanguard entered, the scouts would follow and fan out over the surroundings. The camp and their supplies would come through with the second gate once the immediate area was deemed secure and a message was used to relay the go-ahead to Erantel. Stepping into the portal, Ludmilla entered into a shadowed clearing, through which a bubbling brook cut its way down the rocky terrain. Those that had come in before her were tense and alert, each member looking around nervously at the forest's edge. Save for the sound of the wind through the trees and the water flowing nearby, it was quiet, though their entrance could have easily been the reason for this. "Have you been here before?" Ludmilla asked Kyla, who was covering the eastern approach to the landing. "This is exactly where we left off," Kyla replied softly. "We fought those frost giants right along that brook last week. They probably just dropped us off to continue from where we were, but it feels kinda mean." Ludmilla moved past Kyla as more adventurers arrived through the gate. Across the clearing, there were indeed signs of battle, earth and stone violently displaced, vicious gashes left on the trees by massive blades. One could easily imagine a battle being fought with giants from all of the evidence left behind. Joining the other rangers as they examined the perimeter, Ludmilla mentally reviewed what she was responsible for. While she hadn't participated in any of the training expeditions, she did help organize them. She also had far more practical experience in this type of environment than the other rangers due to her upbringing and ongoing duties on the border. This portion of their procedures was rather straightforward, if not time-consuming, as it involved securing the area where the first base camp would be established. For the rangers' part, they were to ensure that a 1-kilometer radius around the camp was clear of threats, then report in so that the second gate from Erantel could be called in. She made her way around mossy boulders and exposed roots over the rugged forest floor, occasionally looking up at the snowy peaks of the Azalisia Mountains peeking through the treetops. Along her meandering route, the closest thing that might be considered a threat was a den of wolves. They watched her as she made her way by, then followed her a short distance, but ultimately did not make any aggressive moves. At the root of a ranger's ability to bond with their chosen companions was a natural empathy that allowed them to communicate with animals at a rudimentary level through a myriad of means. They could use skills derived from this ability to intimidate animals just as easily as they could attract them. It was one of the keys that allowed one to navigate the wilderness smoothly, as it allowed a ranger to both avoid confrontations and take advantage of the wisdom of the local wildlife. The more one advanced as a ranger, the stronger this natural empathy became, as did the skills that stemmed from it. There were many ways of taking advantage of this ability. Some rangers, like Lady Yora, followed the path of a tamer, who could make even magical beasts their companions. Others went in another direction, combining it with their studies to specialize in dealing with certain opponents. Ludmilla, for instance, was a demi-human specialist, while Mary specialized in the undead. It was difficult to understand how one could specialize in the undead through natural empathy, but the results were undeniable. Needless to say, demi-human rangers could specialize in humans if their environment demanded it, making them some of the deadliest threats to humans that defended the border. After roughly an hour of investigating her assigned area, Ludmilla was satisfied with her findings. She returned to the camp location as twilight fell over the clearing. As the least proficient ranger in the expedition, she was, of course, the last to arrive. "Sorry for the wait," she told Mary. "It's clear on my side. There was a den of wolves, but they shouldn't bother us." "Okay." Mary nodded, then looked around until she found Moknich. Seeing her wave, Moknich nodded at a mage who was standing nearby. Within half a minute, a gate opened and the adventurers started moving in their camp materials and supplies. "How far behind was I?" Ludmilla asked. "About 15 minutes from the first guy in," Mary replied. "Still better than before, though. The first day out of the Great Lake, the 2 rogues we sent out took forever. Pretty sure they got lost a few times, too. After that, we had to pair 'em up with druids." The elf ranger placed her hands on her hips, looking around at the other rangers, who were still assembled from their reporting. "We'll be continuing our survey work from here," she said, but we're narrowing our work area so we don't stick around more than we absolutely need to. Each of your parties will be responsible for a 500-meter wide strip, and we'll be focusing on figuring out the best balance between distance and changes in elevation for the future highway. Are we still following that old mountain trail going north? Poole, one of the gold-ranked rangers, asked. It's been pretty useful as a loose guideline so far, Mary said, but you've seen where it doesn't work. I made it pretty far ahead before I detected those frost giants the other day, and the trail past a certain point won't be suitable for the highway. There's a deep gorge past this range to the north of us, where the trail basically goes straight down a cliff. Soul-eaters might be able to get around no problem, but not the wagons that they're bringing with them. How many more days will that add? The route we'll be taking actually saves us time, Mary replied. Probably a good 2 days. The problem with it is that it's completely above the tree line. That's why the mountain trail takes the route that it does, to avoid exposure to bad weather and baddies in general. We're not going to be camping up there, are we? No, we'll be setting up our camps in the trees below and working above. It's the best compromise between safety and speed. The good thing is that we rangers won't be needed to lead the surveyors. Since the chance of getting lost is basically nil, we'll be keeping watch against giants coming from above. Hope you all didn't forget your mountain gear. No one would forget their mountain gear on an expedition to the Azalisia Mountains. Probably. Ludmilla had plenty of experience in mountainous terrain, and possessed the skills to negotiate her way without equipment, so her gear effectively amounted to protection against the elements. Between her warm clothing and mantle of elemental protection, she would be able to comfortably withstand freezing temperatures far below what her own home reached in the winter. After going over a few more details and answering questions from the gathered rangers, Mary sent them out on their respective tasks. 4 were sent out to patrol the vicinity, while Ludmilla and another were instructed to inspect the camp preparations. The expedition base camp was laid out in a fashion not dissimilar to the makeshift camp that Ludmilla had ordered in Facet County. The reason for this was that Ludmilla had come up with the basic layout for the Adventurer Guild's expeditionary training, and both were based on the patrol camps once used in Warden's Vale. There were changes made to suit the nature of the camp, of course, and there would probably be more coming as improvements were devised by the Guild. The camp was enclosed in heavy wooden barricades fashioned from sharpened stakes, which were reused from the previous camps and replaced using local materials when necessary. Tents housing the adventurers ringed the interior 10 meters away from the barricades, divided into 3 sections. At the center of the camp was a space cordoned off for magical transportation, the expedition supplies, and 2 pavilions. The first pavilion was used to study findings on site and catalogue those slated for delivery. The other, nominally called the command tent, was where planning was conducted and meetings were held. Walking around the perimeter, Ludmilla stopped to frown down at one of the barricades being raised. The adventurers looked up at her. "Something wrong?" one of them asked. "A frost giant can just kick this one out of the way, can't they?" The barricade was set over a flat stone surface, with nothing to brace it. Several were set up the same way. "Yup," another adventurer replied, then looked towards the interior of the camp. "Anyone in the way will be in for a world of hurt. It'll still work just fine for more human-sized things, though. Has anyone come up with a potential solution? Aside from making them out of steel and nailing them into the stone, no," he shrugged. "Won't help if their difficulty rating is high enough, either. Giants over 90 will just kick those out of the way, too." "What about traps or magic?" "Maybe, but our casters are still trying to catch up with their spells, and a trap still might not matter." In the end, the expedition leaders decided that the best way was prevention. Patrols are sent out to detect anything too crazy early on and we intercept them before they hit the camp. Worked the last time, sorta. On the bright side, we got some experience fighting giants under our belts now, so it'll probably go better the next time. If they were as strong as the last group of giants, Ludmilla wanted to add. She didn't want to dampen their spirits so soon after they had arrived, however, so she simply continued on her way. An hour later, the base camp was fully raised, and the adventurers gathered for a late meal. With their recent experience still fresh in their minds, the topic of discussion in every team revolved around frost giants. To be more specific, they were strategizing over how to fight them. She quietly joined her party, settling down on a log with a plate of food in hand. It's ridiculous how much reach they have, Derek, a dual-wielding fighter complained. I can't even get in close. It's like trying to stop a tree every time they take a swing at you. Derek used a saber as his primary weapon and wielded a rondel dagger in his offhand. Through their periodic sparring, Ludmilla understood that he relied on a defensive form that either waited for openings to appear, or worked to create them. It was the style of a duelist, but it was also a style meant for adversaries closer to one's own size. Combatants with superior reach and leverage, like Ludmilla, had few problems beating him as he was. Giants were probably a nightmare for him. Henrich has figured it out, Pan said. You just need to wait till Kyla's gotten in. She'll set up chances for you. That part I understand, Derek said, but what if we get too? I can't do what Kyla does. You probably could in your own way, Kyla said, if you stopped pretending you were a tree. You can't even get close to Ludmilla, never mind a frost giant. Ludmilla wasn't sure if it was appropriate to say anything herself, but Kyla just went right out and said it anyway. Derek's problem was a part of what Einsack had noted when Ludmilla had first realized her ability to perform martial arts, and it wasn't just isolated to him. The vast majority of adventurers joined as they were, meaning that they were little more than a fluffy cloud of hopes and dreams coming from mostly civilian stock. They picked out the adventurer image that they fancied, and the way they fought and thought about fighting was just as fanciful. Those of less durable classes were unapologetically dissuaded by the adventurer training area from such absurdities as mages trying to run in and fight with their staves after running out of mana. Sturdier warrior types, however, more often than not developed various problems as they rose through the ranks. Lower rank training sessions were not very demanding when it came to technical performance. They were designed to raise recruits to safe levels before exposing them to a more risky regimen. The nascent martial school attached to the Adventurer Guild served as a supplement to this introductory training, but one could only learn so fast. Ludmilla's expertise came from over a decade of training. Adventurers were being catapulted to gold rank in a matter of months. The martial training that adventurers received from the martial school was a sort of compromise between learning fundamentals, pushing the acquisition of essential martial arts, and the development of one's own style of fighting. It was accepted as a necessary evil when the members gained in strength so quickly and were expected to participate in expeditions as soon as they qualified rank-wise. To say that one's fighting style was wrong was also something that required extended observation, as there were often no veteran members that trained in established schools of combat or extensive experience to say otherwise. Einsack and Mochnich could help out with longsword and shield technique, Mary could give pointers on one's archery, and Ludmilla with spear-type polearms, except no one else in the Adventurer Guild used polearms. Thus, members were allowed a great degree of freedom in the development of their personal combat styles. There were some fundamental things that were definitely wrong, however. One of the more common problems was that adventurers put great effort into moving their hands, but seemed to forget they had feet. Pretending to be a tree was a jab at this, as Derek was one such combatant. Footwork was an afterthought. He just wanted to be the most impressive-looking two-weapon fighter in the history of ever, swinging his two blades around. Ludmilla supposed that he did try a sort of strange jumping attack once, but her, admittedly annoyed, counter-launched him straight out of the training hall, breaking several ribs and landing him on the pavement near a group of spectators. He stopped using jumping attacks after that. Derek glanced in Ludmilla's direction. "Why don't we just put Ludmilla in my position instead?" he said. "She has an answer for literally every attack you can throw at her." "I don't have a definitive answer for a 7-meter-tall giant using a 9-meter-long spear." Ludmilla didn't look up from her meal. "Especially if they're a lot stronger than we are." "Well, no, I suppose I do. They're called arrows. Since I'm acting as a scout this time, I'll be on lookout duties anyways. You're just gonna have to pull up your roots or get chopped down." "I don't see why all of you offensive warriors are like that anyway," Kyla said. "Shouldn't you be all about proper footwork and maneuvering so you can put your weapons to work? Somehow it's all backwards. All of the defensive warriors are developing their footwork while you lugs just work on swinging your weapons harder." "It's equally important for both offense and defense," Ludmilla told them. "Beyond that, if you can't develop your footwork, you won't be able to learn martial arts that incorporate it. With the reach of your weapons, learning something like shukuchi is essential for advanced combat, but you won't ever attain it if you don't learn how to move properly." Derek blew out a long-suffering sigh, but Ludmilla thought that he probably understood that focusing on his footwork was in his best interests. Martial arts were not only derived from how one used their weapons, but also from how they employed their body. Ludmilla had learned one movement-boosting martial art so far, which she later learned from Mary was a boost art called wind stride, but Shukuchi was still a mystery to her. It was likely that she had probably not pieced it together yet from what had been drilled into her in the past decade of training. She felt that many martial arts floated just beyond her reach, just waiting to be grasped, but it took time to carefully review the elements of personal combat that she had been instilled with by her parents. What did Henrich do, anyway? Ludmilla asked. He fought defensively and got himself in close, Pen answered. It was after we dumped a whole lot of enchantments on him, though. Mary said the first one we fought was the equivalent of Hymethril or Lauracalcum. The frost giants have a lot of protection below the knee, Kylo added. All those layers of hides are pretty much impervious to regular attacks at our rank, and only 200 martial arts have had any success getting through. Henrich got inside the giant's reach and took out her knee with his hammer. People with bladed weapons have to go for the hamstring. They're a lot easier to deal with once you cut them down to size. That seems like an obvious weak point, Ludmilla frowned. Is it really that easy? Surely they'd realize the same thing. The ones that we fought were all the same, Kyla shrugged. I couldn't even get it into my head how big these things were until we actually fought them. They do have armored skirts, which kinda don't matter to us, but trying to make full body armor for a frost giant would be a giant pain in the ass. What about magic? Ludmilla turned her attention to Pen. Is there anything we have in our party that can help? I have a fire spell that seems to hurt them good, Pen replied, but it really pisses them off. I wouldn't use it until the giant is committed to whoever they're fighting in the front. Our divine casters have a few offensive spells as well, but they had their hands full just keeping people in the fight last time. These giants are a fair bit more powerful than our average caster too, so magic resistance becomes a problem for a gold rank. So, we're fighting based on what we learned, with no major changes. Pretty much, yeah, Kyla said. I guess what it boils down to is how many we're up against. 1 feels doable, especially now that we have some experience fighting them, but 2 still border on overwhelming. That's if we don't run into anything entirely absurd. A gentle wind played over the vibrant alpine meadows above the expedition base camp, sending a cool, green fragrance into the air. In the early morning light, 24 adventurers advanced single file through a vast carpet of summer wildflowers that painted the landscape in gold, crimson and indigo hues. Under the icy crown of the Azalizia Mountains, the scenery made the adventurers, who had mostly lived in Urantal or the rural lands surrounding it for all of their lives, gape in awestruck wonder. Ah, this is worth every bit of that hellish training we went through, Kyla sniffed as she wiped away a tear. I wish there was a way to take this scenery back with us to show to everyone. Sure feels more like an adventure, Derek grinned. Mucking around in tangled forests got old before the first day out of the Great Lake was over. Everyone's attitudes were a great deal lighter than before, the nervous edge that they carried was noticeably worn away. The previous day had been solemn and businesslike, with the adventurers conducting their survey work as quickly as was reasonable. Roughly 20 kilometers of montane forest had been covered, with no incidents or encounters of note, save for an unverified rumor that someone had tried flirting with a harpy and was nearly carried off. I don't mean to dampen your enthusiasm, Ludmilla said, but it gets more dangerous here the higher you go, so don't drop your guard. Dragons and giants aren't the only things that live up here, either. Why is that, I wonder? Pen turned her attention away from the nearby scenery. You'd think that the most powerful things would choose the most abundant places to live, but it's like it's the other way around. The more hostile a place seems, the more powerful the creatures become. What do they even eat? Kyla looked to the peaks above. They're so huge, and it doesn't look like there's anything up there. Don't tell me they live on rocks and snow. Ludmilla scanned the rocky moors further up the mountain. She eventually spotted what she was looking for, and pointed towards them. Those things, Ludmilla told them. What things? Derek leaned over, trying to follow the line of her arm. They're called Nook, Ludmilla said. We're headed that way, so you'll see them up close eventually. The destination of the expedition was the point where their survey work had left off, 500 meters above the meadow that they were making their way across. Fiorizo was at an even higher elevation, Or at least its surface entrance was, and the highway's route was to follow a gentle incline that eventually led to the dwarven city. As odd as it felt, Ludmilla was more interested in their eventual arrival at Fiorizo, where she would have the opportunity to study what sorts of ideas and techniques the dwarves used for their population centers. The natural landscape that surrounded them was certainly beautiful, and she could understand why the other adventurers were giddy over it, but it was something like a variation of her home's surroundings. After an hour of climbing from the expedition base camp below, they reached their destination. As Mary had mentioned, the chance of someone getting lost was basically nil. There were no trees, ridges or any other obstacles. It was just a cold and rocky slope that was devoid of any vegetation save for moss and lichen that clung to the stones. Shaggy, four-legged creatures could be seen moving in small herds, grazing on the mountainside. "Those are some big-ass cows," Penn stared at the 3.5-meter-long beasts. "No wonder giants and dragons get so huge." "They're as big as aurochs from the Great Steppe," Kyla marveled. "I thought they'd be more like Lanka." "You've been to the Great Steppe?" No," Kyla replied, "but I read about them." Think we can raise these down around Riestais? The people from my village might be interested." Over their time together, Ludmilla had come to learn that Kyla was from a village in Gonye Barony. With their focus on raising livestock, Florine might indeed be interested in Nux, but "they're mountain animals," Ludmilla said. "I hear some of the races living around here have domesticated them, but they probably wouldn't be happy down in the plains. You'd need some specialized workers too since they're magical beasts." "They don't look very magical to me." Kyla scratched her chin as she peered at the nearest group of Nux. "Do you have any of them on your land?" "Not just on my land," Ludmilla said, "but all along the southern border ranges where it's high enough. They're very hardy, so Nux might be a common sight around the world. Also—" Ludmilla's voice trailed off as she scanned the mountain face. "What?" "Nothing, I was just wondering if any other types of beasts lived up here. There should be things like sheep and goats, at least. The Empire must have originally captured their griffins from some mountainous place, too." She had actually been looking for something like the Kronos but decided that, if Elishnish hadn't recognized them on the night she arrived at Warden's Vale, they probably didn't exist here. She wasn't even sure if the druids of the Kronos were demi-humans or magical beasts, though the fact that they did not appear to react to her like demi-humans usually did had her lean towards them being the latter. The adventurer parties spread out into their positions, which were well within sight of one another. Ludmilla moved over to where Mary and the other rangers were gathered. With the uneventfulness of the previous day, they would be proceeding as planned and serving as pickets to detect approaching threats in advance. "No one needs anything, right?" Mary asked. "Last call, we're gonna be up there till tonight all by our lonesomes." "Should we use these dyes now?" someone asked. Yeah," Mary replied. "Go ahead if you haven't already." Ludmilla retrieved several small globes from her infinite haversack, which were filled with the same sort of magical dye that Elishnish had received with her new braces. She emptied the contents of the first on the hem of her mantle, and the dye spread over the entire item, turning it a dirty white color. After a few minutes, the 5 rangers were garbed head to toe in equipment that would help them blend in with their snowy surroundings. "Alrighty," Mary said as she gave them each a once-over. "I went ahead and checked around the survey route before everyone arrived. The good news is that I didn't spot any frost giants. The bad news is that there's undead further up the mountain." "Undead?" Poole frowned. "How did that happen?" "There's a pass that goes from east to west here," Mary replied. "My guess is that some big battle was fought here long ago, or the pass used to be a major route that saw a lot of fighting over time. Once things get so bad that undead start popping up, it doesn't just go away on its own, just like the Katsa Plains. Battlefields, cemeteries, and other places where unnatural deaths collected often became steeped in the energies that would eventually manifest into undead. Once locations became like this, they were notoriously hard to cleanse. Even the Urantal Cemetery occasionally had a skeleton or zombie appear up once in a while, despite the amount of effort that went into keeping it cleansed. Places like the Katsa Plains had become impossible to reclaim, rendered into a cursed wasteland that was uninhabitable by any living thing. "What sort of undead are we talking about here?" another ranger asked. "The easy stuff," Mary waved her hand lightly. "Doesn't look like anyone is keeping this place clear, though, so it's possible that stronger undead pop up once in a while." You'll be able to sneak around pretty easily, but don't be surprised if you see something like a lesser vampire or an elder lich. There are that many undead? Yup, Mary nodded, so be careful. They're all just standing around since there's nothing for them to go after, but if you blow your cover you're gonna have a few hundred things chasing you all over the place. This wouldn't be a huge problem for any one of the adventurers present to deal with, but the fight would certainly attract attention if there was someone else watching. Ludmilla looked out towards the west, where the bare mountain slopes rose until they were covered in snow and ice. There was no sign that it had ever been a place that people frequented. There were no visible remains of a road, nor were there markers or buildings that might be found along a high mountain passage. Long glaciers flowed out from between the massive mountains framing both sides of the pass, which were still a good 2,000 or 3,000 meters higher than their current elevation. Taller peaks could be seen to the north, beyond the tops of the frozen valleys carved out by the rivers of ice. How far out should we go? Ludmilla asked. Enough to give the expedition a good lead if someone comes running down at us, Mary answered. I know we've all picked up cold weather gear, but don't go so high that you freeze your asses off if the weather suddenly changes. I don't really like how the sky looks right now. They all turned their attention upwards. Thin wisps of cloud were lazily crossing overhead, which often indicated that rain would arrive in the lowlands, at least before Lord Mayor started to occasionally alter the weather. The winds were calm and Ludmilla did not know whether it was warm or cool relative to how the place usually was. What happens if a storm rolls in? Depending on how bad it is, Mary said, we might become useless as pickets. If that happens, head down until there's decent visibility again. We won't be able to hear or see any signal arrows in the middle of a storm, either, so things might get rough. We're gonna just have to make do if something happens. The Orichalcum Ranger looked at each of them in turn, as if waiting to hear if they had any way to improve on what they had. Poole, who had pulled up his cowl, raised a hand. Are we really going to go till the last part of the survey's done? That's right, Mary nodded. We have a good clear run to Fiorizo up here, so the expedition should be able to cover the rest of the distance if we push it. I know it makes it harder for us, but at least we'll be relaxing in the city by tomorrow morning. We should be able to start bringing in the rear early in the evening. Mary fell silent again, waiting for more questions. After a few minutes of silence, she slowly nodded to herself, licking her lips. I guess that's that, then, she said. Ludmilla has mountain training, so we'll put her at the highest altitude. You have cold protection, right? I do, Ludmilla nodded. Where do you need me? Mary pointed across to the southern side of the pass, where a massive tongue of ice spilt down from the mountains to the northwest. The glacier there is the most direct approach to the expedition that frost giants will be able to take, so head up the western side of the valley. I'll be lower down on the eastern side. We'll all be pretty far from one another, so use sounding shot to make sure your signal arrows get high enough to be seen by the rest of us. Two other rangers were assigned positions at the north and south ends of the pass, while Poole was placed halfway between Mary and the expedition route. After one last-minute check, they went their separate ways. Ludmilla's assigned post was about 10 kilometers distant, and she picked her way carefully across the undead-infested pass over the next hour. As she came closer to the toe of the glacier, it slowly sunk in how huge it actually was. The edge of the ice stretched 5 kilometers from west to east, feeding several streams that tumbled into the pass below. The jagged mountain overhead went from majestic to oppressive as she followed the moraine along the glacier's edge up and into its shadow. Her true sight allowed her to see through the gloom with perfect clarity, but she still peered into every nook and cranny as she ascended, half expecting to find a frost giant nestled above with boulder in hand. Like most demi-human tribes, they had their own rangers, or hunters, as they tended to call them, and Elishnish claimed that they were superior to the ones fielded by the Adventurer Guild. Ludmilla's smaller size should give her an advantage when it came to concealment, but size was relative. Beside a mountain, there was little difference between a human and a giant, and there were many places large enough for a giant to lay in wait. Another hour passed as she continued her ascent, and she finally settled on a spot roughly halfway up the glacier. Sitting in a shadowed nook on the mountainside where masses of ice hung overhead, her breath misted the air as she scanned the surroundings above and below. From her vantage, she had a clear view over the entire valley, but she still couldn't see past the top of it. Beyond the occasional flying creature gliding by, the only other things she noticed were the thousands of undead occupying the river of ice. After some time, she decided that their presence was decidedly odd. Mary's speculation placed the probable origin of the energies that fueled them as some conflict or conflicts in the past fought over the pass far, far below. If that was the case, then why did it seem like there were even more undead here? Her unease grew over their presence as the hours passed. According to what she knew of how undead came to be, weaker undead manifested first, and their accumulation eventually led to the genesis of stronger undead. With so many here, Mary's warning about lesser vampires, elder liches and other powerful undead beings weighed upon her heavily. She looked across the glacial valley, wondering if the elf ranger was seeing the same thing. The temperature dropped as the afternoon passed, and it wasn't until the wind started to pick up that Ludmilla realized that something was amiss. She rose to her feet upon seeing the dark clouds that appeared from behind the distant peaks to the north. The ominous wall rolled forward at an alarming rate, darkening the skies above. Light snow started to fall, growing heavier as the minutes passed and the wind started to pick up around her. Looking up towards the top of the glacier, a slight movement drew her attention. She leaned forward, trying to discern what it was. There was more movement, objects seeming small from their great distance. It was only when the object started to fly down closer to smash through the masses of undead below that she finally understood what was going on. They were boulders being hurled to clear away the accumulated undead. It was then that Ludmilla caught her first glimpse of a frost giant. It was not the towering being that her fellow adventurers described looming over them in battle, but a tiny figure that stood no taller than a fingernail against the grey ice of the massive glacier. She hadn't noticed it until it attacked the undead. Perhaps it had been there all along. She spotted more and more of them, sending boulders raining down on the hapless skeletons and zombies below. Were they cleaning out the glacier, just as humans cleaned out undead-infested parts of their territory? She counted the number of frost giants as the number of undead on the upper portion glacier dwindled. There were 30 of them, and they were all at least as strong as an orichalcum-ranked adventurer. As they advanced down the ice, her sense of danger flooded her mind. One other giant had appeared, one larger and far stronger than all of the others combined. Nothing entirely absurd, huh? She made a mental note to have a word with Kyla later about saying ominous things. The wind picked up into a howl, whipping at Ludmilla's mantle and sending stinging powder crystals against her like grains of coarse sand. She made her way down from her perch to retreat back down the moraine. It was not until the full force of the storm's fury rolled past the top of the glacier and over the frost giant advance that she realized what was happening. The frost giants knew what was going on below all along. They were just waiting for the arrival of the storm to commence their assault. It was an ambush, one that brought with it all of winter's fury. The barely perceptible blare of a horn over the howling wind confirmed Ludmilla's suspicions over the frost giant's intent. She peered up at the advancing blizzard, but the weather had thoroughly concealed the giants when it had overtaken them. Completing her descent from her high perch above the glacier and back onto its moraine, Ludmilla looked over at the other side of the valley, trying to figure out where Mary might be. She didn't want to give away her own position by loosing a signal arrow, but, at the same time, she wasn't sure if her voice could reach the ranger on the other side. A movement out of the corner of her vision drew her attention. It was a boulder bouncing down the middle of the glacier. Ludmilla stopped and looked up the slope as more boulders appeared from the blinding snows. They can see through that? Ludmilla couldn't believe it at first, but the giants' attacks were unerringly striking down swathes of undead. The deadly nature of the frost giant ambush went up by a degree. She turned her attention to the opposite side of the glacier again. Mary, the expedition is under attack. 31 giants, at least. They were waiting for the storm. It's going to cripple everyone down there. Her vision blurred and she gritted her teeth as the cost of her ability took its toll on her mental focus. Its range had improved with time and training, but it hadn't improved to the point where she could cast her voice over 8 kilometers without significant cost. Ludmilla started to make her way back down the glacier along the moraine and, after several minutes, she saw the bright red star of a signal arrow flash up into the sky. It appeared that Mary had placed herself at roughly half the altitude that Ludmilla had. Fortunately, the extra range she had put into her ability was enough to cover the distance. Making her way down the slope as quickly as she could without attracting the attention of the nearby undead, her mind worked to find any flaws in the frost giant ambush. It hadn't even been recognized as one until it was too late, which she supposed was the point to any ambush. but it had the same inexorable quality as the glacier both she and the frost giants were making their way down upon. Going by the steady progress she observed as she headed out to serve as a lookout, the expedition would be somewhere around the bend of the survey route, putting them roughly 5 kilometers below the toe of the glacier. The timing of the storm was uncanny, but it probably didn't matter even if it had come an hour or two later. In the short time since she had started her descent, the drifts forming on her path were already above her ankles, and the snows blowing down from the heights only became more and more severe. The leading edge of the storm had probably already reached the expedition. The snow would probably be waist-deep within half an hour, turning the expedition's previously unimpeded path over the bare mountain slope into a treacherous slog. The frost giants, being as tall as they were, would have relatively few issues making their way through. In addition, they appeared to be able to see through the obscuring snows of the storm, and their boulders were turned even more deadly by the howling tailwinds. It was a trap crafted by nature itself, and these giants were well accustomed to taking advantage of it. A powerful blizzard was the last thing that inexperienced humans from the lowlands would expect at the height of summer, who came from a place where it rarely snowed even in the depths of winter. Ludmilla stopped and turned around, squinting into the wind to see if she could figure out how far away their adversaries were. She had no hope of seeing them directly, but the boulders were still coming down the icy slope. Swarms of undead were now turning in unison to run up the glacier. They were close. Frost giants, 5 kilometers from the toe of the glacier. She could only hope that she had reached someone, as she couldn't see if there was any response from below. Nearby undead continued to react to the frost giant's presence. She instinctively ducked as a boulder smashed into the ground not 100 meters distant, blasting a divot into the ice and instantly destroying the dozens of skeletons and zombies in its path. The giants were too fast. In the time that she had made her way halfway down from where she was, they had nearly closed the distance. It was only a matter of time before one of their hunters would notice her if she kept running down in the open. She ducked behind the ridge of the moraine, pulling a fire arrow out of her infinite haversack and knocking it to her longbow. Ludmilla took a quick inventory of her surroundings. She was in a trough between the glacier's moraine and the mountain face, whose icebound heights loomed at the top of a sheer cliff face. There were some boulders, that ranged from her own height to the size of a barn, strewn about that could potentially act as cover. The glacier itself was cracked and lined with crevasses as it reached its terminus. As long as their strides were, the frost giants probably couldn't cross the gaping chasms. Was it something she could use? The dull thud of another boulder impacting the ice on the other side of the moraine shook the ground. Then another. Probably not. The giants would be going around the sides to avoid them. That meant they would run right into her. The boulders that had just cast in her direction were clearing the way of undead. She quietly made her way down the trough, ducking behind a boulder twice her height and peeking around the other side. All that greeted her, however, was the blowing snow. She returned behind the shelter of the boulder and took a calming breath. A booted foot stepped down right next to her. Ludmilla dropped her bow. Extending her arm, she called her glaive to hand. Activating ability boost as she pivoted to attack, her horizontal slash sheared into the thick hides wrapped around the frost giant's left shin, cleaving through flesh and bone. The giant roared as he fell, and the boulder behind her shifted as he grabbed at it for support. The massive being stumbled forward awkwardly, crashing to the ground. Ludmilla lunged forward to push the point of the glaive deep into one of his shocked, golden eyes. The blade pulled out as easily as it had entered, and Ludmilla unequipped the glaive. She stepped back to retrieve her bow and arrow from the ground. Heart-pounding, she strained her senses for the approach of another giant. The one that had surprised her gave no sign of its approach. If not for the glaive bestowed upon her by Lady Schultier, she would have been clearly outmatched. Could she lie and wait for the next giant who came to investigate its fallen comrade? There had been 31 in total before the blizzard blew over them, and at least half of them were probably coming her way to avoid the hazards of the glacier. Several zombies shuffled over to the corpse of the frost giant, belatedly attracted by the disturbance. Ludmilla frowned over at them, then realized that she might be harder to notice than she had initially thought. For whatever strange reason, the majority of corporeal undead that manifested from pure negative energies were human in appearance. All she needed to do was make sure that she didn't stand out. The dead frost giant might have even assumed she was one of the relatively harmless undead, thinking he could casually destroy her as he passed. Ludmilla turned her gaze up towards the darkening skies. Perhaps Sursana was looking out for her. Heavy footfalls fell from beyond the boulder, and the nearby undead shuffled towards the new sound. Ludmilla padded away in the direction of the next piece of cover. From somewhere behind, a massive object cleaving through the air could be heard over the wind. The next giant was probably not a hunter, given how clearly its actions could be heard and felt. The giant's steps came again, sending pieces of loose ice and snow skittering down the cliff nearby. The undead were still attracted by its presence, but its pace did not slow. The sound of its weapon striking down the undead swarming towards it grew closer. Could she surprise this one too? Bone Cleaver. Ludmilla dove forward as a tremendous crack filled the air. She rolled up to her feet and turned to see that the boulder she was hiding behind had been split in half by a massive axe. A basso voice filled her ears with its amusement. Ho, something actually came out. A white? A vampire? Before her stood a male frost giant. Fortunately, it was not the large one that had appeared just before the attack commenced, but she sensed that it was still about as strong as a vampire bride. If she could get in close, the absurdly powerful glaive would do the rest. She focused her attention on his movements as he casually swatted the dozens of undead that came after him aside. Trying to intimidate me with a skill? He said as he took another swing. If you were strong enough to kill my brother there, I'd hardly think it necessary. A skill? The giant furrowed its bushy brow and frowned behind its blonde beard. Don't tell me, you don't even know what you're doing. Ha! You're as ignorant as a goblin. Without another word, he stepped forward, axe raised high. Ludmilla quickly knocked an arrow, loosing it towards the giant's feet. The tanglefoot arrow shattered on impact, affixing the giant's foot to the wind-blown stones with alchemical glue. Her next arrow lit its beard aflame. Partway into her next draw, something struck her from behind, pushing her forward slightly. She looked over her shoulder to find that a skeleton had struck her in the back. Her attacks against the giant had revealed her to the undead nearby. Wind stride. Her pace quickened, speeding her along as she circled around the giant. The undead chasing her changed direction and went to the giant instead, who was now the closer target. When the agitated frost giant reflexively swept his axe around to clear them away, she switched to her glaive and charged forward. The dark, pulsing blade sliced through the ankle of his back foot, then stabbed forward into the other. Ludmilla twisted the haft in her hands and ripped out its tendon with a horizontal cut as she withdrew to recenter herself. She moved back around to recover her bow and carry on down the darkened slope. A boulder smashing into the cover ahead of her cut short her escape. Leaving so soon? A woman's voice called out. Ludmilla turned to find that the largest giant had caught up to her. Behind him and to his side was a female giant, who was hefting another boulder in her palm. This one's no good, Sigurd, she said. As weak as the kids we sent out last week. Sigurd scrutinized Ludmilla from where he stood. At a mere glance, Ludmilla could tell that this fight would be impossible, even more impossible than fighting a Death Knight or a Death Warrior. The huntress behind him was well above adamantite, as well. These were the powerful frost giants that the adventurers had been warned about. It's her weapon, Sigurd. The frost giant on the ground shouted towards them, a spear, or something. It's more powerful than a frost reaver. She's nothing without it. Ludmilla glowered at the frost giant, who was continuing to swat away undead after being crippled. In hindsight, she should have finished him off. That so? Sigurd raised an eyebrow, hefting a two-handed axe that looked like it was made from shimmering ice. Plunder usually comes after a challenge, but who am I to complain? The 8-meter-tall frost giant strode towards her. His steps effortlessly kicked through the 2-meter-tall snowdrifts, shaking the ground as he went. Unlike the other two frost giants she had fought, he was encased in midnight black plate armor with no clear gaps to exploit. Wait, Ludmilla said, I'm not interested. Still under the effects of ability boost and wind stride, she danced backwards from Sigurd's advance. The frost giant followed her around with an unbothered expression. Drawing a fire arrow, she loosed it directly at him. His axe shifted slightly to block her attack. The arrow shattered. Its contents splashed over the axe blade and ran down the handle, but did not ignite. She barely spared a thought for the odd occurrence, reaching for a tanglefoot arrow in a bid to at least slow his momentum. She released the missile as he stepped onto a snow-free section of ground. The arrow shattered, but the alchemical glue passed through his foot. The sight was reminiscent of the spell Lady Shultier had cast to free Elishnish from her entanglement. A freedom effect. Petty tricks won't help you here, Sigurd told her. Embrace death like a true warrior. She looked all around them as she eluded the reach of his weapon. The huntress was yawning to the side, her disinterest in the fight plainly clear. Ludmilla found it hard to believe that Sigurd did not possess the means to close distance with her. Going by Elishnish's description of their culture and the way he carried himself, it was as if he was saying unworthy with every step. One did not use martial arts or skills to crush a bug. They made another round, with Ludmilla releasing arrows all throughout. Sigurd deflected all of them with his axe, and even the lightning arrows failed to take effect. She peered up through the storm at the mountain above. Ludmilla reached into her infinite haversack, retrieving 3 large glass arrows. She increased the distance between herself and Sigurd. She steeled herself with a strain from her favorite hymn and raised her bow. Sursana, Lord of Judgment, unleash thy certain death. Sounding shot. It was a simple ranged martial art that the expedition rangers had to learn. It had no additional offensive power, as it was developed to send arrows over an exact distance. The adventurers used it to loose their signal arrows high into the air so they could be spotted by distant observers. The 3 glass arrows streaked up into the sky, ignoring the vicious winds. Sigurd snorted. Brunhild. Got him. The huntress cocked her arm. Intercept. With a grunt, Brunhild hurled the boulder in her hand. Everyone stopped to look upwards, tracking its course. The huntress' attack hurtled into the air, curving in mid-flight to smash each of Ludmilla's arrows in turn. The concussion arrows erupted in sequence, unleashing a rippling bang that could be heard clearly over the wind. Was it enough? It was. None of them would escape this. As the loud crack of collapsing ice filled the air, Sigurd and Brunhild frowned down at her. Ludmilla offered a serene smile in return. Very well, let us embrace death.